And that makes us much, much more of a target because of our interdependence. If you strike at Ireland, you can damage the wider EU and the wider West. And that is well known in Moscow, it's well known in Beijing.
Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Nilo, a regular podcast bringing you news and views from around the world. I'm your host, Neil O'Sullivan. In earlier episodes, we reported on China's lack of adherence to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and their increasingly aggressive grey warfare tactics in the West Philippine Sea and Taiwan Strait. In this episode, we report on a troubling pattern of subsea cable breaches in the Baltic Sea. The most recent incidents happened in Swedish waters on November 17th and 18th, causing disruptions to internet traffic. Sweden, Germany and Lithuania have launched criminal investigations into suspected sabotage by a Chinese ship. Stay tuned as we talk to Owen McNamara, Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki, to dive deeper into these recent incidents and examine the regional reactions and implications for countries like Ireland and the broader EU. Two subsea cables, one linking Finland and Germany and the other connecting Sweden and Lithuania, were damaged in less than 24 hours on November 17th and 18th, prompting German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius to say he assumed it was sabotage. The suspected culprit is a Chinese-registered bulk carrier, the Yi Peng 3, which was travelling through the area after departing the Russian port of Ust Luga, west of St Petersburg, on November 15th. Reuters news agency have quoted Western intelligence officials from multiple countries as saying that they are confident the Chinese ship caused the cuts on both cables. But they have expressed different views on whether these were accidents or could have been deliberate. This is not the first time a Chinese vessel has been suspected of damaging subsea infrastructure in this region, and raises concerns of a wider pattern of hybrid warfare. Irish listeners will be familiar with news reports of Russian ships behaving suspiciously off the coast of Ireland in areas where subsea cables also exist. Coming up, we'll chat with Owen McNamara in Helsinki about the recent events in the Baltic. But first, I'd like to take a moment to ask for your support. I'd really appreciate it if you could give this podcast a like or subscribe on your podcast app or on our social media pages. Your support would really mean a lot. But on to our interview. I recently spoke with Owen McNamara about these recent events in the Baltic. He's a research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. I began by asking him to fill us in on what's known so far about these recent cable-cutting incidents.
Well, what's known so far is that it was a rogue Chinese flag vessel, and that Swedish investigators suspect that this damage has been done on purpose, and it comes on the back of a lot of incidents in and around the Baltic Sea and the North Atlantic. Last year, around the same month, October, November last year, we had damage to the Baltic Connector gas pipeline that links Estonia and Finland. And that was an anchor slamming in. It was a very unusual incident. If it was an accident, it would have required incredibly poor seamanship from a ship that had, circumnavigated half the Earth, from a crew that had, circumnavigated half the Earth from Shanghai through the Arctic Sea route and around to the Baltic in the autumn of last year. Whether the crew had changed or not of that ship, it docked in Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave in the Baltic Sea, but an anchor slam, and that also 3 different cables were severed at that point as well in the same in related incident. A cable linking Estonia and Sweden, a cable linking Estonia and Finland, and a Russian cable, a cable linking with Russia, was also damaged in that incident. And before that, a couple of years before that, we had damage to a cable connecting, mainland Norway with its Arctic island of Svalbard in the northern far north of Norway in the Arctic. And a lot of communications take place there. There's a satellite station So that connection was very, very important as well. And Norwegian investigators at that time made the assessment that the damage was man-made. But of course, some would link these incidents to hybrid tactics if they are committed on purpose. And of course, with hybrid tactics, it's all about plausible deniability, showing your adversary or your competitor or the state you want to intimidate or threaten that you can cause damage, you can cause discomfort without being caught and without being subsequently punished for it.
In this recent incident, again, you mentioned it's a Chinese registered bulk carrier. I think it's called a Yi Peng 3. The evidence suggests that the ship's anchor was dragged along the seabed for over 100 miles, causing the severing of the cables. How likely is it that the captain of a ship like this, a relatively new ship, I think it was built in 2001, would not have been alerted that the anchor had been dropped, right? It's very strange, isn't it?
Yeah, as I mentioned, poor seamanship is given as one explanation, as one hypothesis, but it is very, 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 very unusual. There are systems on these ships to detect these anchor drops, and these anchor drops are very, very unusual anyway. If they are to be done by accident without the captain of the ship noticing. So yes, either there's a lot of very, very poorly educated seamen getting licenses to captain these ships, or there's something more untoward going on. And this incident that sliced up these cables, as I mentioned, was very, very similar to the same anchor drag for a very long distance that slammed into the Baltic connector gas pipeline, and cut those cables linking Sweden, Estonia, and Finland already last year. So there is a pattern of behavior emerging here. The tactic is becoming quite clear to identify.
And where is this ship now?
I believe it's docked in Swedish waters.
Okay, so this is a part of the investigation that Sweden are trying to conduct on what happened, right?
Yes. So there are rights and obligations in international waters and in exclusive economic zones. So there are probably discussions ongoing as to whether to tow it somewhere, or to interview the crew to see what their perspective on things are. When we look at the previous incident with the Baltic connector, the crew were actually able to get away without being questioned by investigators and by the relevant authorities, and it was very hard to catch up with them, so to say. I mean, it took maybe less than a year, maybe 6 to 9 months after the Baltic connector incident before China said anything. It agreed it would cooperate, but then it also said that it believed that it was an accident, and that nothing was done on purpose. So it's a kind of a catch me if you can, find out if you can type of cat and mouse game here. And as I mentioned, the Baltic connector incident really foreshadows what happened in the Baltic Sea this November.
And some sources are speculating that the Russian Federation are suspected of orchestrating this sabotage. And as you mentioned earlier, possibly using the Chinese ship for plausible deniability. Who do you think is behind this?
Well, that's very, very hard to tell. And we've been wrong before. I mean, it looks now, say the Nord Stream gas pipelines, when they were sabotaged to many international headlines, many of us thought that it might have been Russia trying to send the signal. But it turns out that the strongest hypothesis that has emerged for that sabotage so far in late 2022 has been that it was a group of Ukrainian vigilantes that wanted to make doubly sure that gas would never travel through those pipelines again from Russia to Germany. Of course, after Russia's escalated war in Ukraine in February 2022, the Germans suspended the passage of gas through the Nord Stream pipelines. So there's lots of actors, but collaboration between Russia and China should never be counted out. Nonetheless, I would argue. I mean, I was speaking in Krakow last week, and talking to Poles, Polish students, and my argument was, with China and with Russia, maybe the Chinese are a bit closer here than we think, in terms of possible hybrid aggression. I mean, we saw during the summer there were drills between the Chinese military, I think it was special forces, and the Belarusian military right on the border of the European Union, a capacity building message. China was trying to possibly send a signal through that. And of course, China and its kind of soft facilitation of Russia and Russian aggression in Ukraine. And now we're seeing Chinese flagged vessel, or Hong Kong flag vessel, or Chinese flag vessels getting involved in very unusual incidents that are bringing a lot of damage and disruption to undersea infrastructure under the Baltic Sea. So there is a pattern emerging here of Russian aggression, but also Chinese hybrid aggression in Europe, showing that they are willing to escalate in terms of the strategic competition they see with the European Union and they see with NATO and the wider West.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you say, because a few episodes back I spoke with Ray Powell, who is the director of an organization called Sea Light at Stanford University. He's been studying China's maritime behavior in the South China Sea, and he mentioned, how China have been sending like deep sea research vessels into their neighbors' exclusive economic zones, similar to what we see from Russia here in the EU, and also like there's suspicious instances of cable cutting around Taiwan and other places. So I suppose collaboration couldn't be ruled out based on those kind of things.
Yes, and it's still hard, I think, for Europeans to deal with China in this regard and try and bring China to task. China still has a lot of economic leverage over Europe. A lot of EU states are still quite ambivalent towards China. Russia is a clearly defined threat. But a lot of European states are willing to give China maybe sometimes the benefit of the doubt. Ireland, I would maybe count among those states. So still, you want to keep China on side. You don't want to push China away. There's some economic interdependence there. It makes it harder to take China to task for these instances. And of course, when they say it's all an accident, where do you go from there? You better have very, very good investigators with very, very clear-cut evidence. How do you then punish and deter China from doing these incidents again in future? It looks like a challenging task.
So what has the official reaction been then in these affected countries for these recent cable cuttings, like Germany, Finland, Lithuania and Sweden? What are they saying officially?
Well, officially, they say they have suspicions that this might not have been an accident. But of course, in democratic countries, we have jurisprudence, we have due process, and they say these are complicated international investigations, and it takes more time to get these things done. So due process is the message, but there's a lot of commentary and analysis coming out to indicate that these events are very, very unusual, and that it's very unlikely with this pattern of behavior that's emerging that it could be purely an accident. Connections are there to be observed.
And is there much of an economic impact for the countries involved for this cable cutting?
Eventually there will be. I mean, single cables can be replaced relatively quickly. But of course, the thing is, I mean, with insurance, if cable cutting becomes regular, then the price to insure these cables rises. And of course, that will all be passed on to the consumer. It was the same with the Baltic connector, the gas pipeline, that cost, it was 40 million euros to replace. and it was paid out by the insurance, and the companies that operate that pipeline had to pay that out. So eventually, if your premiums go up, the price of these commodities, gas, data, all those things go up as well. And in a cost of living crisis, that increases the pressure further. And of course, when we look at it from a more tactical perspective, maybe from a Russian perspective, and if China is collaborating on this with Russia, I mean, the big movement we've seen in the Baltic Sea in recent years, or in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that they were very, very dependent on Russian gas and Russian electricity coming through pipelines. From it used to be said about the Baltic states when they left the Soviet Union in 1991, they restored their independence. But from an energy perspective, it was said you can check out, but you can never leave. But they've checked out, and now they're definitely leaving. I mean, the gas delivered through these pipelines is being suspended. The Baltic states aim to disconnect themselves from the Russian and Belarusian electricity grids fully by 2025. But of course, the other side of this, Neil, is that has led to more Nordic-Baltic integration in energy supplies and with undersea data supplies. And that all goes through the sea. So Russia's energy weapon is being dismantled. But hey, the Chinese and the Russians saying, hey, not so fast. We have these hybrid tactics, and we can still disrupt that infrastructure of yours, linking Baltic Sea states running under the sea with these tactics, leading to different forms of strategic and economic challenges.
And you mentioned, the only way maybe to get to the bottom of this is following the legal due process. And I read that this recent one, it raises complex legal issues related to international maritime law. And for example, detaining a foreign vessel in international waters is unusual and requires careful consideration of legal precedents. Can you tell us a little more about the legal challenges here?
Yeah, so that detaining a vessel in international waters, or even within an exclusive economic zone, is difficult, and it can lead to a very big international incident and escalation and things like that. So you can make a mountain out of a molehill in a way. And I think those that wage these hybrid tactics know that the Danes and the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Finns, the Baltic states, they will be very, very careful around sticking to the law there. That is their forte. That is their reputation. So those that wage these tactics know the sensitivity of this, and know that might even, they're kind of using international law to their advantage. And they know that it might be easier to get away with it, or it might be easier to conceal things from investigators. So they're kind of, international law is supposed to be a multilateral and a universal instrument for good, to make sure order is kept within exclusive economic zones, within territorial waters, and within the high seas. But they're kind of using international legal instruments to their advantage. And Russia and indeed China, there's a long pattern of that. But it's not just, I would say, the law here. If we're to deter this behavior, deter this activity into the future in the West, in the European Union, in NATO, and in the US, we also need to look at, an increase of naval patrols, among Baltic Sea states and North Atlantic states. This is all being discussed at the moment. But also, not just, we can take all the patrols we want, but we also must have much more coherence in terms of information sharing and communications between the different navies of NATO and of the European Union, reporting these incidents. So these incidents can be, and this behavior, these maneuvers, can be seen quicker and anticipated more in future, and can be detected. And we can see the pattern of behavior. So, and then there's also technological solutions, undersea innovation. So submersibles, sensors, undermanned sea vehicles, bringing the West's technological edge to bear as well, to better monitor this infrastructure, because this infrastructure is the lifeblood of our economies around the Baltic Sea and in the North Atlantic, affecting states like Britain and Ireland as well.
In mid November, the Irish Defence Forces observed a Russian spy ship, the Yantar, which I believe is an auxiliary general oceanographic research vessel. It was operating 3 drones in Irish controlled waters in the Irish Sea. And there have been many, of course, previous instances of Russian ships behaving suspiciously in Irish waters. What are the implications of these events in the Baltic for Ireland, do you think?
Well, I mean, the two theaters, if you want to talk about the Baltic and the North Atlantic, where Ireland is, the two are very much interconnected. Russia definitely sees them as interconnected. If they put pressure, if they put pressure on one, it leads to repercussions in the others, and of course, in Ireland, I mean, we are quite vulnerable. I mean, because we have depleted. I mean, I've great time for Óglaigh na hÉireann and the Irish Defence Forces. Many people would know that. I've been back a few times teaching at the Cora Camp, the Joint Staff and Command course, and I've very much enjoyed that. It's not really the military's failing. We've got incredibly dedicated people in Óglaigh na hÉireann and some great minds and some great leaders and commanders. I've had the honor of meeting lots of these people in the last few years. It's really kind of a problem of political will in Ireland, and we've just had the election. That in no, nobody vests more in civilian power to structure the military, to structure the army than Ireland does. It comes from our legacy after the Civil War. So, our problem here is that we just don't have enough. First and foremost, naval personnel to mount the patrols that we need. We don't have enough naval hardware, and we don't have enough naval technology to survey this infrastructure. And more so than in the Baltic states, I would say Ireland is very exposed. We're a global data hub. We really rely on undersea infrastructure and also undersea electricity connections. The one with the UK. The connector there, and also the one that is now planned with France. So this is really the lifeblood of our economy. And Ireland is very unusual in the sense that I've heard different leaders within the Irish Navy talk of sea blindness. We're kind of blind to this maritime domain, even though it is a lifeblood of our prosperity, which is an unusual turn of events.
Yes, I mean, and I think everybody in Ireland, the government included, are aware of the risks. I mean, they publish a national risk assessment every year. The one for 2024 called out those things you mentioned, those interconnectors with the UK, and of course the subsea infrastructure in our exclusive economic zone. However, the amazing thing to me is that, while this Baltic cable sabotage happened during the run-up to this recent election in Ireland, and the Russian ships were manoeuvring in the Irish Sea around then also, and there's widespread awareness in Ireland's lack of defence and monitoring capabilities. These stories don't make big news headlines here. They didn't even trigger discussion in any of the recent election debates. So I was curious about, how the public in other EU countries, maybe like Finland where you are, do these attacks on subsea infrastructure get a lot of media attention or public interest there?
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. I mean, I remember when the Chinese ship was on the move, everyone was talking about it. If you were following Finnish news websites, we were getting our hourly updates on what was happening and how the Danes and the Swedes might respond. It was the same with the Baltic connector. I remember. I remember a press. Nordic countries are very cool, calm, and collected. So I remember that time. It was October last year. I was sitting in my office and I heard a press conference was being called to discuss a major national security incident, to brief the public, so that transparency is key. So in Ireland, I would say, I mean, I follow the Irish. I've been writing a bit about Ireland and the defence forces and the defence situation in Ireland in my spare time. So I still follow the Irish media quite a lot. I might read Irish newspapers more actually to keep in touch while I'm abroad than when I'm at home and with my at my parents' house in Carrigan-Shore. I mean, the media reporting and the media detail has actually been very, very good. RTE have done some good programs. Irish Examiner has been very good, particularly on the naval side. Irish Times have all actually been quite good. The interesting thing about Ireland is that how that doesn't actually filter into political discourse Media discourse is one thing, but the politicians are really, in my opinion, and I've met a few politicians. I gave evidence before. I haven't, not just in bar rooms or shady or seedy places. I gave evidence before the Oireachtas on security and defence policy, before the Oireachtas EU committee in 2023. So I've had some up close and official discussions with politicians. They see the concern, but in Ireland they're willing to take the risk. This, there could be blowback associated with this willingness to take the risk, that sure, it won't be too bad if it ever happens, or sure, our neighbours will come to our aid if something does happen, and there'll be solidarity for us. But that mightn't always be the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a view among some people in Ireland also that, we're a small neutral country. They play up the neutral aspect, and they kind of ask then, we're neutral. Why would anybody want to hurt us or cut our cables? What would you say to that? Is neutrality a protection?
Well, that's how we see ourselves, but that's not how we are seen. And that's not how we are seen by those that want to strategically compete with the West. We are seen as an integral part of the West, an integral part of the Western economy. And we shouldn't be surprised that we are seen like this. It's something we're very proud of in Ireland, all these tech multinationals, all these data centers, and being an open economy. With lots of Western connections. Now, that was okay. We our consciousness, we used to be a small peripheral island, but now, if you're to quote, Department of Foreign Affairs documents, we're referred to as a global island. And we haven't really, and this happened when the world was a much more peaceful place. Our economy started to grow in the early 1990s after the Berlin Wall fell down. We were into a period of the peace dividend in Europe. And there wasn't a whole lot of strategic competition about. But now, for the first time in our history, we will enter a hostile period, most likely, of international affairs as a wealthy Western country. And that makes us much, much more of a target because of our interdependence. If you strike at Ireland, you can damage the wider EU and the wider West. And that is well known in Moscow. It's well known in Beijing and Tehran and places like that, whether it's by military intimidation, whether it's through hybrid means, or whether it's through cyber attacks. And we've seen a variety of these threats emerge on Irish shores much more prominently in recent years.
These kind of infrastructure attacks certainly raise the temperature at a time when, geopolitically the temperature is already high. Do you think this particular incident, and now coupled with the previous ones you mentioned by these Chinese ships on cables and interconnectors, do you think they will have a big effect on China-EU relations going forward?
Well, if they keep going like this, most certainly. Most certainly. And there's also room to escalate. We can, I see scope for more unsavory incidents. There was a report done, it was in 2023, a report done, it was a collaboration of investigative journalists from the 4 Nordic countries. It basically, it was done in the North Atlantic and in the Baltic states, and they looked at these shady ships, so to say, carrying interesting or unusual communications equipment and hovering very close to critical undersea infrastructure nodes. And I remember there was one scene, Danish journalists approached one of these ships on a speedboat, and they saw someone armed, a very sophisticated armed man on board. So we're talking maybe private contractors with the skill sets of special operators. Wagner Group is no longer working, but we see lots of Chinese PMS, private military contractors, protecting Chinese interests in Africa. We're going to see more private military companies out of Russia, essentially conducting these hybrid operations. So I remember when I was teaching our lads, our Oglig Naheran, I discussed, in Ireland that we might play down the threat, or our politicians might play down the threat, because of course it's politically feasible or politically appealing to do so. They say there's no votes in defence, but externally, or in and around Ireland, that doesn't mean these threats have gone away. And there could be some wet night out in the North Atlantic. We're a naval service boarding team boards one of these vessels, and they find very, very nasty characters on board with very sophisticated military skills. Either with either Russia or China paying their tab, and that goes for any EU navy as well. So, how would you say that the fuse is there? These operations are happening. Just the light has not been lit on the fuse as yet. But if that light is lit on the fuse, if we get incidents like this out at sea, where the line of contact between EU militaries, including Ireland, including our naval service, and special operators, nasty characters funded by the EU and Russia on these ships, if these confrontations are to take place, or if a confrontation like this is to take place by surprise, the possibilities for escalation are very, very significant. And that will have a big knock-on effect on political relations between the EU and China.
And Kaja Kallas is the new EU foreign policy chief. She's already said that China must face higher cost for backing Russia in Ukraine, in the war in Ukraine. And the EU has also proposed targeting Chinese companies and individuals with visa bans, asset freezes over their dealings with Russian firms linked to Moscow's war effort in Ukraine. Do you think broader EU attitudes to China are toughening, in this area, becoming more cautious, more wary perhaps as well, as a result of their interactions with Russia?
Well, I think the EU is gradually starting to wake up to China now. I mean, we all saw the economic benefits of China. I mean, there's a lot of interdependence there, and we thought that China would economic interdependence. We thought that China, in the European Union, would see economic interdependence in the same way we would see it. Mutual economic benefits, not to be exploited for political or strategic gain. The unfortunate thing is China doesn't see things like that. It sees things through a hybrid lens, and its hybrid lens sees that these dependencies that come with interdependency can be exploited at some point in the future. If you own a lot of EU infrastructure, and you want to kind of coerce the EU out of its own independent policies, its own independent foreign policies that it wants to pursue in line with its values, you can use that dependence against the EU. So China doesn't, I remember the 1990s, early 2000s, and China was seen as a great opportunity. That has really now turned in the EU focus because of China's behavior. On Russia, yes, the same thing. China has been very careful not to supply Russia directly with military technologies as yet, but it has supplied Russia with a lot of dual use technologies, and it has kept a very significant trade link, as has India, open with Russia for Russian energy products, which has kept Russia afloat as it has faced a barrage of Western sanctions. So yes, we need to get tough on China for this, because of course China can have a major role in convincing Russia that out of its aggression, because of course this aggression is not great for world order, for international security. And of course China should be interested in all that as well. This is the other side of Chinese behavior, because China wants to grow its economy, wants to grow its development for its people. It's not just completely focused on strategic competition like Russia might be in Europe right now. So a stable international security order will benefit that side of Chinese foreign policy much better. So we need to talk China in terms of our diplomacy. We need to talk China into that type of pragmatism to convince Russia to halt its aggression.
Even though the Chinese don't consider Russia's invasion of Ukraine an invasion, they call it something else, right? I think are we being naive, thinking that China wants to, or would consider, or would want to convince Russia to halt its aggression?
I would say China is torn in two minds. Unfortunately, the old mind, the mind of economic development and and more prosperity for its people and economic transformation, that's its mind of the 2000s or of the 1990s, and its mind of strategic competition and restoring China as a great power that won't be pushed around, but will do some of the pushing around itself. That mind is really becoming dominant at the current time, and that's very worrying for global order. On Russia. On Russia, we must remember US, but leading up to and after, Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, we must remember the discourses of US foreign policy at the time. Russia, before 2014, was actually being given the benefit of the doubt in Europe. And under Obama, particularly, the United States was talking about the pivot to Asia and pivoting, and it was drawing down its forces from Europe. The US was getting threadbare. I remember the Poles and the Baltic states were saying, hey, guys, this might be a bit hasty. And they even had to, because the Europeans were getting concerned, they even had to rename this pivot to Asia the rebalance. So looking on from Chinese eyes now, this is fantastic because, of course, the United States and the US was going to focus a lot of its assets on Taiwan, on the South China Sea, maintaining open seas in the Indo-Pacific region, seen as a very important region for the global economy. Now, of course, the United States has to think about its interests more on two fronts because of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. So in that regard, the United States had to cancel its drawdown, had to put in more forces, and we now had the enhanced forward presence in NATO. So it stretches US resources and it stretches European resources. And the focus now is not so much on engaging with China or building this pragmatic strategic partnership with China. The Chinese might have had the more skeptical view that the pivot to Asia was all about deterring China and curtailing Chinese power. So keeping the EU and keeping the US in particular engaged or even embroiled on two strategic fronts, it's definitely in line with China's aims to rise even further as a great power.
Okay, Owen, well, some great insights there. Thank you very much for sharing them with us. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thanks very much, Neil.
That's Owen McNamara, who is a research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. My sincere thanks to Owen for sharing his valuable insights with us on Perspectives with Nilo. According to the latest reports to hand at the time of posting this podcast, the Chinese vessel, the Yi Peng 3, is now anchored in the Kattegat in an area of international waters, but inside Denmark's exclusive economic zone, closely watched by Danish military vessels. News outlets are reporting that Scandinavian legal experts have indicated that because the vessel is located in international waters, unless there is evidence of a specific kind of environmental crime, Denmark lacks the legal authority to conduct an opposed boarding outside of its 12-mile limit. Denmark could board if the vessel's flag state, that is China, gave permission for a law enforcement investigation to proceed. To this end, discussions between China and several of the affected countries are ongoing, with Sweden requesting the ship to relocate to Swedish waters for further examination as the cable damage occurred in their jurisdiction. The discussion is also continuing as to the nature of China's involvement and Russia's role in the whole affair. One of the more insightful comments I've read is from Johe Olsen from Swedish Kinemedia, whom we've interviewed before on our podcast. He has remarked how many have forgotten Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow last year, and in particular when he openly and approvingly told Vladimir Putin that their two countries together are driving changes not seen in a century. And as Johe points out, he was not referring to financial policy. We'll continue to monitor this story moving forward and post updates on our social media channels. In the meantime, if you'd like to find out more about any of the topics discussed in this episode, we've placed additional information in the Dive Deeper section of our blog at pwnilo.com. There you'll also find links to our social media and past episodes. But that's where we leave it for the moment. As always, thank you for listening. And until the next time, slán agus beannacht.